The village nestled deep within the emerald embrace of Nagaland's hills was a place where myths wove through the air as thick as the morning mist. Elders whispered of spirits that walked among men, their true forms hidden behind human faces. Yet for those caught in the throes of love, such stories felt like mere echoes of a past too distant to matter. Among the many who had heard these tales, but given them little thought, was a young warrior named Kavito. Kavito was known not only for his skill with the spear, but for his heart, brave, kind, and full of longing for something more than mere survival. The village women admired his strength, and the elders respected his wisdom beyond his years. Yet, despite the many eyes that turned toward him, his heart had remained untouched until the day he met Shambili. She had arrived one evening, just as the sun melted into a river of crimson behind the hills. No one knew where she had come from, no family, no past, only the name she offered. But such was the way of the world. Sometimes people wandered from distant lands, seeking new beginnings. The moment Kavito saw her, he felt the stirrings of something inexplicable. Shambili was unlike any woman he had ever known. Her beauty was otherworldly, her eyes dark as the depths of the forest, her smile gentle yet unknowable. She moved with a grace that seemed almost unnatural, her laughter like wind chimes in the evening breeze. It did not take long for whispers to spread. Shambili and Kavito had become inseparable. He would meet her at the river's edge, where she would dip her hands into the cold water but never drink. They would walk beneath the towering trees, their roots twisted like the veins of the earth, speaking in hushed tones of dreams and futures. Kavito was enraptured. He had heard the warnings of the old. Love that comes too easily is like fire. It warms, but it also burns. Yet he could not turn away. When he declared his intent to marry her, the village rejoiced, though some eyes lingered with unease. She had no family, no past, no dowry to offer, but Kavito wanted nothing more than her hand. The wedding was a grand affair, drums echoing into the night, firelight painting golden patterns on their faces as they were bound together in the sacred ceremony. Shambili wore red, the color of passion and fate. As Kavito took her hand, he felt the warmth of her skin, solid, real. Whatever questions lurked in the corners of his mind, he silenced them. She was his, and he was hers. The early days of their marriage were blissful. She cooked for him, weaving unfamiliar herbs into meals that smelled of distant lands. At night, she would hum melodies he had never heard before, tunes that made the hairs on his arms rise even as they lulled him to sleep. There was a depth to her, a mystery he longed to unravel. And yet, there were things he did not understand. She never ate in his presence. When they shared a meal, she would push her food around her plate, smiling, urging him to eat instead. "I am not hungry," she would say. At first, he dismissed it as a simple quirk. But as the days turned into weeks, unease began to coil in the pit of his stomach. The village, too, began to notice strange things. Dogs went missing. Chickens left their coops, but never returned. A hunter swore he had seen a shadow move too quickly through the trees, faster than any beast should. The elders muttered, their wrinkled hands drawing protective symbols in the dirt. One night, Kavito woke to an empty bed. The fire in their home had burned low, casting flickering shadows along the walls. The door stood slightly ajar, a whisper of wind curling through the opening. His heart pounded as he stepped outside. The forest loomed before him, dark and endless. He told himself she had merely gone for a walk, that there was nothing to fear. And yet, as he stood there, listening, he heard something, a sound so foreign, so raw, that his breath caught in his throat. A wet, tearing noise. A low, guttural growl. He took a step forward, but then he stopped. Shambili was standing at the edge of the trees, her back turned to him. Her shoulders moved in an odd rhythm, her breath heavy. In the dim moonlight, he saw her lift something to her lips. Something dark, something dripping. A sickening realization took root in his mind. She was eating, and whatever it was not food meant for men. He wanted to call out her name, to demand answers, but some primal instinct kept him frozen. He could not move, could not breathe, as she slowly turned her head, too slowly, too deliberately. Her eyes met his, and in them he saw hunger. Kavito could not move. The weight of Shambili's gaze pinned him in place, and the night felt thicker, heavier, pressing in around him like an unseen force. The moonlight carved pale lines along her face, illuminating her lips, glistening with something dark. The sharp scent of raw flesh curled in the air, metallic and thick, mixing with the damp earth beneath their feet. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the distant croaking of frogs, the rustling of leaves in the midnight wind. Then, slowly, too slowly, Shambili licked her lips. Something inside Kavito shattered. His mind fought to reject what his eyes had seen, grasping for any explanation other than the one creeping through his thoughts like a shadowy serpent. He had known something was strange about her, but never, never had he imagined this. His wife, his Shambili, the woman he had laughed with, shared his nights with, held in his arms, was crouched before him with the scent of blood clinging to her like a second skin. His breath came shallow and ragged. He took a step back, his foot pressing into the soft earth, and at the sound, Shambili straightened. The way she moved sent ice through his veins, graceful, deliberate, yet tinged with something primal, something wrong. She tilted her head, her dark eyes unreadable, and in the silence, she took a step toward him. "Kavito," she murmured, her voice the same as always, yet different, thicker, slower, like honey laced with something bitter. "Why are you awake?" He couldn't answer. His throat had closed, trapping the words, the questions, the terror that clawed at the inside of his ribs. He took another step back. Shambili mirrored him, her bare feet whispering against the ground. There was something almost playful in her expression, like a cat watching a bird just before pouncing. Then she smiled. The firelight from their hut flickered against her teeth, and for the first time, Kavito saw them as they truly were. Too sharp, too white, too many. His stomach lurched. He wanted to run, but something told him that any sudden movement would be the end of him. So he forced himself to breathe, to swallow the bile rising in his throat. "What were you doing?" he finally managed, though his voice came out hoarse, barely more than a whisper. Shambili blinked, as though surprised by the question. Then she sighed, tilting her head back to look at the moon. "You shouldn't have seen that," she said simply. A chill wrapped around Kavito's spine like a noose. "What are you?" His voice was steadier this time, though his hands were trembling at his sides. She looked at him again, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, she wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, smearing the darkness across her pale skin. "Does it matter?" she asked almost gently. "I'm still your wife." The words sent a shiver through him. A lie, a plea, a warning. He could not tell. His heart thundered so violently he was sure she could hear it. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to turn, to flee into the trees, to never look back. But Kavito was not a coward. "Tell me the truth," he said, the words heavy in his mouth, leaden with dread. "No more secrets." Shambili studied him for a long moment, and then, to his horror, she laughed. A low, lilting sound that sent a fresh wave of nausea through him. "The truth," she echoed, stepping closer. He forced himself to remain still, though every nerve in his body rebelled. "You love me," she said, her voice soft now, coaxing. "You chose me, and I chose you." She lifted a hand, as if to touch him, but he flinched, and something in her eyes flickered. Hurt? Amusement? Hunger? "You don't want to know," she murmured, but the way she said it told him it was already too late. The truth was a sickness, and it had already taken root. She turned away then, walking past him, back toward the hut. "Come inside, Kavito," she said without looking back. "It's cold." And then she was gone, disappearing into the warm glow of their home as though nothing had happened. Kavito remained rooted to the spot, the distant hoot of an owl, the only sound breaking the silence. His body ached with the need to flee, to put as much distance as possible between himself and whatever it was he had just witnessed. But another part of him, one bound by love, by duty, by the weight of his own choices, found himself following her inside. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting shadows against the walls. Shambili stood with her back to him, her hair cascading over her shoulders, hiding her face. "Kivito," she said softly without turning, "if you truly love me, you will not ask again." The air felt thick, suffocating. He could not answer. For the first time since he had taken her as his wife, he felt like a stranger in his own home. And somewhere, deep in the pit of his stomach, he knew this was only the beginning. Kivito did not sleep that night. He lay beside Shambili, listening to the steady rhythm of her breath, his body tense with the weight of what he had seen. The fire in the hearth had burned low, casting long shadows that flickered against the walls. His mind churned with memories, the way she had arrived in the village without a past, the way she never ate in his presence, the disappearances of animals, the unease that had spread like a sickness through the village. And now this. The image of her crouched in the dark, her lips stained with blood, was seared into his mind. He could no longer deny what was in front of him. She was not like the others. She was not like him. The thought settled in his chest like a stone, heavy and immovable. He turned his head slightly, watching her in the dim light. She looked peaceful, her face serene, her lips curved in the faintest hint of a smile. It was a cruel deception. The woman he had loved, the woman he had sworn himself to, was something else entirely. A predator. The realization sent a chill through him. He had to leave, had to warn the others, had to save himself before it was too late. Carefully, he slid out of bed, moving slowly, cautiously, so as not to wake her. His heart pounded as he stepped toward the door. The cool night air pressed against his skin as he stepped outside, the village silent under the watchful eye of the moon. He would go to the elders, tell them everything. They would know what to do. But as he turned to move, a voice, soft yet sharp, cut through the silence. "Where are you going, my love?" His breath caught. He turned slowly, and there she was, standing in the doorway, watching him with unreadable eyes. The fire behind her cast her shadow long and distorted across the ground, making her seem taller, more unnatural. Kivito forced himself to speak. "I need to clear my head," he said, his voice steady despite the fear curling in his stomach. She stepped forward. "Lies do not suit you," she murmured, tilting her head slightly. "You are afraid of me." He did not answer. He didn't need to. Shambili sighed, as if disappointed, and took another step forward. "I told you not to ask," she said softly. "I told you not to look." Kivito clenched his fists. "What are you?" The question came out harsher than he intended, filled with equal parts terror and sorrow. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she smiled, a slow, deliberate thing that sent ice through his veins. "Does it matter?" she whispered. "I am yours, and you are mine." He took a step back. She took another forward. "You would leave me?" she asked, her voice laced with something dangerous now. "After everything?" "You are not what I thought," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She stilled. For a moment, the mask slipped, and he saw something raw in her expression, something close to hurt. But it was gone as quickly as it had come. "Then you leave me no choice," she murmured. The night seemed to hold its breath. Then she moved, faster than thought, faster than anything human should. One moment she was standing in the doorway, the next she was in front of him, her fingers cold as death closing around his wrist. He gasped, struggling, but her grip was iron. "Do not fight me," she whispered. He twisted, wrenching himself free, and stumbled backward. His instincts roared, and he turned and ran. His feet pounded against the earth as he tore through the village, past sleeping huts, past the darkened homes of those who had unknowingly lived beside a monster. The trees loomed ahead, their branches reaching like skeletal fingers, and he did not hesitate. He plunged into the forest, heart hammering, lungs burning. Behind him, there was no sound, no footsteps, no breath, nothing. But she was there. He could feel her, watching, waiting. The forest closed around him, swallowing him whole. He ran until his legs burned, until his breath came in ragged gasps, until his mind screamed for him to stop. And yet, he knew he could not. Not yet. Not until he was safe. A rustling sound to his left, then to his right, a whisper of movement. He whirled, his pulse a drumbeat against his ribs. Shambili, he called, though he did not know what he meant to say. To plead? To demand? Laughter. Soft. Close. He turned again, and she was there, standing among the trees, her dark eyes gleaming, her lips curved into that same knowing smile. You cannot run from me, she said gently. You were mine the moment you chose me. Kavito's breath came fast and shallow. He took a step back, then another. Her expression did not change. But then, slowly, deliberately, she stepped forward, and in the shifting moonlight, he saw her for what she truly was. Her skin, too pale. Her teeth, too sharp. Her fingers, too long. A thing wearing the face of a woman. His wife. His hunter. A scream rose in his throat, but he swallowed it, turned, and ran again. The forest blurred past him. He could hear his own pulse roaring in his ears. He could hear nothing. No footsteps. No breath. And then, just as suddenly, she was in front of him. He skidded to a stop, his chest heaving, his mind a frenzy of panic. She watched him with something almost like affection. You should not have run, she murmured. He lunged forward, desperation making him reckless. He swung his fist, aimed to push past her, but she moved too quickly. The world tilted, and before he could register what had happened, he was on the ground, his back pressed against the damp earth, her weight pinning him down. She leaned in close, her breath warm against his skin. I would have spared you, she whispered. I would have let you live beside me, happy, ignorant. But you looked. You saw. Tears burned his eyes. Please, he gasped, though he did not know what he was begging for. She exhaled, slow, almost sorrowful. Then, gently, she pressed her lips to his forehead. Hush, my love, she whispered. This is mercy. Pain. Sharp. Cold. Then nothing. By dawn, the village awoke to silence. The birds sang, the river flowed, the trees swayed in the wind. And Shambili, wrapped in her red shawl, sat outside her hut, her gaze fixed on the horizon, waiting for the next to choose her.